IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of All Things Policy. I'm Malathi Renati, and I head the policy school at the Takshashila Institution. And today we have with us three PGP students, Debashree, Jaydeep, and Avantika, who are from the current 48-week postgraduate program in public policy conducted at the Takshashila Institution. The topic that we will be discussing is about the power sector in India. So I'd like each of you to quickly introduce yourselves before we get into what we'll be discussing today. Avantika?
Thank you, Malathi. Hi, I'm Avantika. I work with startups, government, and civil society organizations on initiatives promoting quality education, skilling, entrepreneurship, community engagement. I previously have been a Gandhi Fellow and have worked extensively in Aspirational District Transformation Program. Thank you.
Thanks, Avantika, and welcome. Jaydeep?
Thanks, Malathi. I am Jaydeep. I work in the field of finance and pricing for the past 12 years. Public policy happened as an area of interest and which is now getting deeper and deeper as an area of focus for me. So happy to talk through about the power sector today. Thank you.
Welcome, Jaydeep. Debashree?
Hi, I am Debashree Chatterjee. I am a public relations professional. And during one of my assignments in renewable energy client, I just realized the dynamic policy scenario in India. And I got introduced into this subject. And since then, I have been reading. And thanks to Takshashila, I have got a chance to dig deeper in it. And I look forward to have this conversation on power sector today. Thank you so much, Malathi, for this.
Thank you, Debashree, and welcome once again to all three of you. It's great to have you on this podcast. All right, so let's start exploring this topic. Right now, power is one of the basic components of infrastructure. Right, it defines the country's economic development and also the quality of life of its individuals. But the challenges of the power sector in India are many. It's starting from insufficient electricity generation to poor infrastructure and management, this lack of investments, and of course, the shortage of raw material. So in this podcast, we will sort of broadly try to cover three aspects. We'll first go into the market structures and the failures. Then we'll touch upon the current policies and some of their unintended consequences. We'll also look at a small case study in the process. And we'll finally conclude with exploring the viable solutions for the improvement in the sector. All right. So maybe just to get started, to give us an overview of the power sector, Debashree, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. Thank you, Malathi. So basically, just to give you an overview, India is world's third largest power producer and third largest consumer also. So this sector is basically divided into four components. First is the energy supply, second is the generation, third transmission, and fourth is distribution. So one important thing in the power sector is, in today's age, that we have 56% of our power generation is happening with coal as energy source. India is trying to diversify energy source into renewable energy supply. Transmission and distributions are largely state controlled in this space. So to give you a generation, so as you know, this power sector is divided into four segments. So I would like to take you through the generation construct first. So India is seeing a rapid growth in the energy sector. The power generation is increasing at a fast rate. In fact, FY23 has seen a very high growth. Installed generation capacity, if we talk about, it is very half controlled by the state and central government, and half of it is done by the private sectors. Right. Installed capacity wise, if we talk about the energy source, non-fossil fuel is account for 42.5% of the sector, and fossil fuel accounts for 57.5% of the sector. So as of now, May 2023, thermal capacity is having a very significant portion. About 56.8% of the installed capacity is fossil fuel based. But India is seeing a very high installation of renewable energy. Solar energy, we have achieved about 67 gigawatt capacity. Wind power, we have achieved 42.86 gigawatt capacity. Biomass, small hydro projects, waste to energy, hydropower are also coming into the mainstream. Electricity security has improved in the country over the years. So, if we look at the electricity consumption in India, so about 41% of the electricity consumption is happening at the industrial space. Domestic consumption is about 26%, followed by agriculture at 18%, commercial at 8%, and others miscellaneous 7% consumption. So the International Energy Agency estimates that India will add 600 gigawatt to 1,200 gigawatt of additional new power energy capacity before 2050. So that's a tall target. So India has achieved close to 100% electrification in all rural and urban households. So if we see, India has achieved quite a lot of energy security over the years. And however, the electricity consumption per capita is at 1,327 kilowatt, which is quite lower compared to the other developed countries or even many developing countries. The government of India has made remarkable progress in providing access to electricity and clean cooking while implementing a range of energy market reforms and integrating a high share of renewable energy sources into the grid. The demand of electricity for cooling is projected to grow rapidly. So, according to the statistics, the particular energy requirement for cooling demand will increase about 8 times till 2037-38 compared to the 2017-18 baseline.
Debashree, I'd just like to kind of also mention here, since you spoke about the renewable energy, that there's a push to move towards renewable energy, right? And currently we still depend heavily on fossil fuels, as you indicated with the numbers too. Now, even in the recent G20 summit at New Delhi, just concluded, the G20 leaders themselves have agreed to accelerate efforts to actually triple the global renewable energy capacity by 2030. Right? But considering all this, we know that this is still a way to go before we can achieve those targets, right, in India. So what's the market structure of the Indian power sector at this point in time? If you can just throw some light on that.
As you rightly mentioned, India has been a front runner of this entire energy transition. And in fact, India has a tall target of 450 gigawatt by 2030. Before we delve into deeper onto that subject, we should look at the market structure, as you rightly asked. So Indian power sector is quite complex. It has a lot of regulatory intervention. The entire 4 stages of that power sector: energy sources, generation, transmission, and distribution. There are many places it is highly governed by the state and central governments. So as we know that, Indian power sector is heavily dependent on coal. About more than 50, around 56-57%, the primary source is coal. It comes majorly from Coal India Limited, about 84%, which it produced around 2017 and 18. This coal gets auctioned through a Shakti scheme, okay? So that price is not controlled. Tariffs are not regulated. Prices are determined through auctions.
Right.
In the generation space, if we look at, when we talk about fuel sources, the generation happens 64% in the thermal and rest in the renewable energy and other spaces. In this space, 50% generation is controlled by the government bodies like central government and state government companies. And about 50% is generated by the private sector companies. When we look at the transmission side of the power sector, so it is completely regulated by the state and central government, Power Grid being one of the largest player, and also there are state transmission utilities. On the distribution segment, if we see, it is like, it is highly run by the state machinery. However, the metro cities like Delhi and Mumbai, we have private companies coming in for the last mile distribution. However, the tariff regulated here is by ACRC. So interestingly, when you are actually buying coal for producing the energy, the coal prices are not regulated per se. It happens auction wise. But in the distribution, the last mile distribution space, the tariffs are regulated by ACRC. So there is certain, implications. And I guess Avantika and Jaydeep will, throw some light on that part as well.
Thank you, Debashree. And yeah, like you mentioned, right, the monopoly, whether it's at the transmission part of things or, the distribution is quite evident, right, in what you indicated. So let's just look at the market failures now. And we know that the market failures that we have are not just the positive and negative externalities, but the monopoly, as we just noticed, and also the information asymmetry. Right? So, Avantika, what are the market failures that we notice?
So, as you rightly pointed out, in all these four areas and headers, there are market failures that exist for the power sector. I would start off on a positive note by highlighting the positive externalities first. So, electricity remains an enabler for consumption of merit goods. For example, in case of education, the access, quality, the technological interventions can be ensured when there is proper supply of electricity for various services to be delivered. In case of health, we saw that how during COVID, the intervention of vaccine and trackage of vaccine coverage was enabled by electricity. On taking from the point of renewable energy sources, that we are definitely one of the leading powers to produce renewable energy sources. We hold 5% of the world's share in renewable energy. We have to now find ways to keep the supply unhindered and make that shift towards more renewable, supporting the electricity consumption overall. In that sense, we can see that electricity definitely has very positive ripple effects on the progress of the society. Highlighting some of the negative impacts that are currently being experienced are especially when electricity generation is heavily relied on thermal sources, then the greenhouse gas emissions are very huge, and the social cost, which is the damage to the environment or how public health hazards are related to it, are also quite significant. Coming to how the power sector is experiencing monopolistic market, I would like to mention that there are certain portions of the power sector, like the wire arm of distribution network and the grid operators that can be in a particular place. Those are finite in nature, and by that very basic nature, they do tend to be inherently monopolistic. So on that, we do see that how the markets tend towards being concentrated. I would finally highlight how information asymmetry is playing out in the power sector currently, especially due to the low penetration of smart meters. Consumers don't get real-time data and understanding of what their consumption is and how can they reduce that or manage that consumption pattern. So there are basically very limited avenues for them to understand what their bill value can be, how do they manage that, and that leads to a lot of discrepancies in terms of electricity utilization. Even when we talk about when long-term power purchase agreements, which we will understand in detail as we understand government intervention in the market, there is an effort to open up the market, but then there are conflicting signals on that end. So not being clear on subsidy information is also something that becomes a problem and constitutes information asymmetry. So these are the following, the ones that I mentioned are the market failures that currently exist in the Indian power market.
Right. Yeah, interesting, that you've mentioned these. Now, considering that we have so many market failures, what are the government interventions in the complete supply chain of the power sector?
Right, and there are quite a few. So let me just present the flow chart of the same.
Right.
And as my cohort mate Debashree previously mentioned, the various arms of electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. The government has an intervention in all of the three. So as we've learned that Coal India produces majority of the coal in the country, and there it is not very effectively governed by market forces, and it's not open for it to be it to be validated through the national or international price competitive standards. So that's one. The government is also, by the virtue of giving subsidies to producing renewable energy, trying to intervene in the generation part of the power sector. And they definitely, when it comes to transmission, the state electricity commissions and are the ones that basically play a role in regulation and transmission issues. There is also the central commission that oversees all of this. Given that electricity falls in concurrent lists, so both center and state governments play a part. When we talk about distribution, be it both to industrial consumers, bulk consumers, or small consumers, the discoms come into play, and where majority of the discoms are currently owned by the government. And this is the broad overview of how government is intervening at each particular stage. I would also want to highlight that the amount that can be charged from the consumers is also, it is overseen and signaled by the government. So this, I would request my colleague to highlight more on how the government interventions are playing in the market.
Yeah, thank you, Avantika. Thanks for that. So it's evident here that the government is playing quite a large role, maybe more than necessary, right? So, Jaydeep, if you can just kind of start off by us looking at the tariff control by the State Electricity Regulatory Commission and what its impact is on the discoms, right? So, because we know that the stages of electricity supply in India is in three parts, right? You have the generation, and then you have the transmission to the distribution substations. This is through a grid, and then the distribution finally to the consumers or the end users through a network. So if you can please touch upon that.
Yeah, thanks Malathi, and thanks Avantika and Debashree for setting the stage. So we are looking at the interventions in the reverse order. So we are looking first at the distribution arm, followed by something on transmission, followed by generation. So
right.
In the tariff structure, so tariff structure is primarily what you and I pay for the electricity we consume. Now, the way the SERCs and the CERCs, which Avantika was pointing out, the State Electricity Regulatory Commission and the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission, they are tasked to regulate the tariffs that discoms can charge from you and me, right? So the SERCs and CERCs, what they do is they have invented a cross-subsidy mechanism, which would mean that the domestic and agricultural consumers would be charged less in comparison to the industrial consumers, so that the agricultural produce and domestic consumption can be done at a cheaper price. Now, in doing so, what has really happened is this. I will give you some example of states, right? For instance, the state of Punjab, its agricultural power consumption is 28%. Its contribution to the electricity revenue is zero. Compare that with the Punjab industrial consumption. Industrial consumption of power is 34%. Its contribution to the net revenue to DISCOM is 49%. It's almost half. Now, one can say that Punjab is an extreme example. Let us not take that extreme example. Okay, fine. I'm coming back to the more industrialized state like Telangana, for instance. Close to 30% agriculture consumption and close to 30% industrial consumption. Exactly the same percentage, more or less, right? Contribution by agriculture to the electricity revenues, only 3%. Industry contributes almost half, 46%. And the story is on and on. Only exception here is Rajasthan. I mean, Rajasthan is the only state where agricultural consumers are paying for the electricity in proportion to their consumption. And I think the reason for that is that the government cannot let farmers have free power because there is a water scarcity. It's a desert state. So that is how the tariff structure is controlled. Now, what does it do? So before understanding what it exactly does, let us understand what is a tariff. What are the constituents of a tariff in the bills that we see? So DISCOMs try to recover a fixed cost and a variable cost. Now, discoms have various kind of fixed costs because the way this supply chain works is discoms signs power purchase agreements with the generation companies, for instance, the NTPCs and NHPCs and all of them, on a long-term basis and give them a commitment of buying power for a long-term period. And in order to service that commitment, they have to pay a fixed price over and above the consumption-based price. So discoms' fixed costs are, it varies from, state to state, which state or which city are we talking about? It ranges from, 30 to 70, 40 to 74% of the total cost of discom. And how much is the fixed cost transferred into the bill? It is not more than 27 to 40%.
Right. So Jaydeep, if I were to just ask, how have the discoms actually reduced their losses?
So there are various mechanisms through which loss has been distributed. I won't say they have reduced the losses technically, but what they have done is they have made a left pocket, right pocket adjustment. So discom losses, by the way, in FY 21-22 stands at 6.2 lakh crores. Total debt, not losses, total debt of discom is 6.2 lakh crores. Now, what is supposed to happen is because the state which is asking the ACRCs and the respective ACRC to reduce the tariff is doing so as a political promise to their voters. So what is government supposed to do is give the subsidies to the discoms. So a big chunk of discom revenue should come from government subsidy. Now, what the government does is when discom losses mounts to a surmountable amount, it releases a subsidy check so that the discom can clean its books. Ideal world, they should make a budgetary allocation for discoms so that they can pay subsidies to the discom on time so that discoms books are clean. But that is not how it plays out in reality. So what has happened is because discom losses keeps mounting and discom debt keeps mounting, it percolates down to the Gencos and it percolates down to the generation companies as well, energy supply companies as well. So it creates a loop of systemic risk in the system.
Right. Okay, we'll be heading into a break very soon. But before that, maybe let's look at a case study. So Jaydeep, if you have a case study of how the Gencos and the power purchase agreements happen, that would be good to explore.
So coming to the generation arm of the story, which is much more meaty, So how does I told you that these discom signs long-term power purchase agreements with the Gencos. Now, if anybody can read those PPAs that want to watch, they are unidirectional and they are absolutely one-sided contracts, which just says discoms can renegotiate at any time, terminate at any time, discoms will not pay any liquidated damages, etc. So they are very one-sided agreements. Now, what has happened is certain states, even with those unilateral one-sided contracts that are signed, there are still tariffs that you have to pay from the discoms to the Gencos. Gencos are eligible to get some money now, and those are predetermined tariffs that has been written in the contract for per unit of electricity sold. How much is discom supposed to pay? But what has happened is whenever there is a pressure from the top in order to reduce the tariff, discom says we cannot bear losses. You are not giving us subsidy payment, so you go and talk to the Gencos and ask them to reduce the tariff. And the Gencos generally say that, look, you have signed a contract. You cannot come to me and say in the middle of the contract that reduce the tariff because you want to make a political promise. Now, in the past, what has happened is multiple times these SCRCs who imposes tariffs has gone to the respective high courts of certain states and asked them to terminate the contract. And some high courts have given judgments that no, you have to enforce the contract. In anticipation of this judicial proceedings that's happening, in 2021, the Punjab government, what they did is they made an assembly session and they cancelled as a matter of law. They cancelled some PPA power purchase agreements as a matter of law. So they just said that all those agreements with one or two Gencos stands cancelled if they are not agreeing to renegotiate. And that is a law of the land. So contract laws, of course, civil laws will override the contract laws. So in order to reduce by 3 rupees per unit, that is what the idea was, to reduce before the election in Punjab. So as a matter of law, and Gencos had to abide because they had no legal recourse left. So that is how government influences both the distribution and the generation companies. And by the way, generation arm, at least 46% is private owned. It is not fully state owned. So
Right. Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Jaydeep. So we'll now take a short break, and once we return, we will start by looking at the unintended consequences we had as a result and how they've panned out. Right? So do stay tuned. Welcome back from the break. For those who have just joined us, we are actually in the middle of an interesting conversation with three of our PGP students, Avantika, Jaydeep, and Debashree, who are currently pursuing the Takshashila Institute's 48-week postgraduate program in public policy. And the topic we were exploring was on the power sector in India. So in the first part, we looked at the market structure, we touched upon the failures, along with going over how the current policies work. And before the break, we concluded with a case study of the Punjab power tariff. Now, we'll get into how, or rather, we'll look into the unintended consequences of these policies before exploring the viable solutions. Jaydeep, if you can just touch upon the different unintended consequences that have resulted from the policies that have been spelled out.
Sure. Thanks, Malathi. And some of the unintended consequences of government intervention is, I would go with the first one. Now, as I have explained, the cross-subsidy regime means domestic and agricultural power consumers will pay lower tariff, and the industrial power sector consumers will pay a higher tariff. Now, what does it do to the industry per se? It just makes their production cost very high. So by an estimate in FY 2019, 75,000 crore is the surplus that the industry paid to the power distribution companies in surplus. And that makes our exports extremely uncompetitive. So if the government of India has a priority on export promotion, by charging industries abhorrent high power consumption rates on electricity, is just making their production cost very high and making the goods very uncompetitive. So that's the first unintended consequence of having a cross subsidy regime. So from industry, moving on to what it means for people like me and you, just to give you a statistic, this is the NCRB data. On an average in India, every day 30 people die out of electrocution, which means that short circuits, the wires falling on people, and people walking in the road and suddenly sticking into a khamba, as it is called in the Hindi heartland. So that the number of deaths is shocking, is 30 people every day. It is not from a crime. It is not from any other reason. It is just because the wires are hanging low. And why the wires are hanging low? Because DISCOMs doesn't have money to repair the lines. Right. I mean, that is another unintended consequence. Now, you mentioned at the start, Malathi, about the G20 and its commitments to green energy, etc., etc. Now, what does the green energy, renewable energy sector needs? Right? It needs the renewable energy producing state should be seamlessly selling them to the renewable energy consuming state, which would mean that the transmission networks of DISCOMs must enable interstate transmissions. Right? For that, the current transmission network, now currently there are some interstate transmission that happen, but very, very few. But for an RE industry to really boom and RE to replace fossil fuels, the transmission network has to be much more sophisticated. And by the way, RE is cheaper source of power as well. Now, the unintended consequence here is that the DISCOMs have very little incentive to do that. Because if they do it, if RE power is cheaply available, what does it mean? It means that the industry will definitely go to REs to buy the power. Why would they stay with the DISCOMs who are charging them some abhorrent price? Now, and if that happens, how does the cross-subsidy regime survive? It will not survive. So there is a very, how do I put it? It's an incentive in a wrong way for DISCOMs to disincentivize people to buy RE, and that is why they will not invest in the transmission projects, right? And that what it does to our green energy targets. I mean, it's evident we are not able to get out of the coal dependency. So that is another unintended consequence, and one of the last unintended consequences, what it does to this free power to agriculture sector, what it does to the groundwater. I mean, agriculture is 90% of water consumption in this country. And if we keep giving free power for irrigation, what effectively happens in state like Punjab is that the pumps are used to dig out water and throughout the night, because the electricity is free to run the pump, and the water level just goes down and down and down. So we are eyeing towards a deep water crisis because of not able to charge for power to the farmers, right? So this is almost leading to an environmental catastrophe in certain states.
Yes. No, I totally agree, Jaydeep. Unless we kind of have some measures put into place, right? We are actually kicking the can down the road in terms of putting things off. But now with climate change, and it's evident that the government too has to step in and make changes, right? So we're hoping that, that means that there'll be better policies that are formulated. I know we all hope and we all have to be optimists end of the day, right? And so we all also look at viable solutions that could possibly mitigate and, if not solve, the issues that we have at hand. Right? So, Avantika, would you want to kind of explore some of the possible solutions that you all have thought of?
Right. So, shedding some brighter light onto the power sector story, there are few solutions that can be tried out. One is, of course, to consider targeted subsidies and direct cash transfers, so that targeted subsidies will definitely encourage consumers to make more effective decisions on their consumption. A consumption beyond a particular threshold will push them out of the subsidy. So that will definitely help in reducing the cost to the exchequer that is currently faced. To coming to the second point in solutions, there can be more competition, and there's a critical need to introduce more competition in the distribution arms of power supply, which are two. One, the supply companies themselves, and the second bit being the physical wire network that is utilized to transmit electricity. Coming to one more area where competition is needed is the supply part of the distribution, so that consumers can have a more effective consumer experience. But when the sector is more opened up to players coming in, they have transparency in how to participate, and people are also aware of the possible options, that will be a helpful state for the power sector. The draft Electricity Amendment Bill 2022 requires DISCOM to provide open access to any other DISCOM operating in the same area to supply to the current network on payment of certain charges. How effectively this is being done is something that needs to be looked at and worked upon. One of the final points in tariff structure from my end would be that if we cannot allow tariffs to be determined so wholly and solely by the market forces, we can consider at making the SERCs and CERCs determine the more cost reflective tariff in order to incentivize private players to come into the distribution network. This will allow people who are in the sector to make independent decisions about pricing, and the consumers also will be enabled to take up different sources, and there'll be a reduced switching cost in case of a change. So while it is a tricky road, but the interest of both the generators and the consumers can be protected, and that delicate balance can be achieved.
Thanks, Avantika. So, Jaydeep, if you could just briefly touch upon some of the other viable solutions we have before we conclude.
Sure. Thanks, Avantika and Malathi again. So, apart from the tariff reforms that Avantika was proposing, there are other things that we can also look at. One major thing is, how are we designing the SERCs and CERCs? As we have previously spoken about, SERCs are the ones who design tariffs, right? So, currently, the design of the institution of SERC is a bit problematic, because what it does is it makes the state's joint secretary as one of the person who would select the members of SERC. Along with it, it has the chairperson of CERC, which is the Central Regulatory Commission, and the CEA, which is the Central Electricity Authority. Along with it, a high court judge. They kind of, appoint the members of SERCs. Now, if this is the selection committee, and majority voting would determine who would become an SERC member. Now, if in this majority voting, there is a state government representative, there is a central government representative, and an independent representative from judiciary is a minority voter. So obviously, there can be a very strong influence. Although SERC are supposed to be an autonomous body, it just makes enough room for government intervention. So the design of this institution can be made a little more, the selection committee or who can be thrown out of SERC. So are we making very clear guideline on what can be the criteria for people to be terminated from SERC? So those institutional design questions have to be addressed. More autonomous people should be there in the selection committee. The other thing that I want to touch upon is, as I mentioned in my intervention problem, right? So the PPAs are the power purchase agreements are the determinant for 90% of power purchase in this country. But did you know that there are 3 power exchanges in this country? There is 3 power exchange, which is wholesale power market from which trading of electricity can be done, but it accounts only for 4% of trading. So those markets has to be made more liquid. So we must endeavor that we should not impose PPAs on Gencos and let the wholesale power market function more properly. And the last but not the least, if something is loss making, general commercial acumen tells us that if a company is loss making, it should go insolvent. So the discoms which do not make profit should go insolvent, and the government should not intervene and try and protect, because it poses systemic risks in the system, because discoms take loans, Gencos takes loans, the energy suppliers take loans, and then it piles up NPAs, etc. So if something is loss making, we should just let them go. So those are
right. Well said, Jaydeep. Yes, and we should actually allow the market forces to operate, right? Eventually, that's what will kind of ensure that things pan out evenly. Right. So would you want to touch upon maybe the roadblock that we have to reform?
Yeah. So the biggest roadblock in power sector, there has been reform in the power sector here and there. For instance, the state, the Power Finance Corporation tries and buys out loan and keep it in its books and makes the bank's balance sheet clean. But those are band-aid reforms. The major reform that is required in this sector is how do you pull out of a government intervention, and how do you let market forces operate? And for that, there is a political economy question that we are trying to remedy here, because this Bijli Sadak Pani promise is there in political manifesto since the 1970s, and we have to really find out a way where populist promises are not made in elections, or there has to be a positive narrative that is built across political parties, wherein we try and reduce the populist tone and make a case for market forces to operate. So it's the major roadblock is the political economy.
Thank you. And on that optimistic note, thank you all for your time. But before we wrap up, any closing thoughts? Let's start with you, Debashree.
Yeah, so just to conclude, I would say that power sector in India is quite complex, has a lot of political interference, regulatory issues. But one thing we must say that, over the decades, power sector has become an enabler of Indian economy. The generation is increasing at a very high speed. The government is taking interest in renewable resources. So the sector is likely to go at a very high speed. So the reforms will be key to make this economy a success. So that is what I feel.
Thanks, Debashree. Avantika?
I would just like to conclude that while we definitely need to look at demand side management, along with the same, we have to resolve our tariff related issues, the energy storage problems that the renewables face, so that there's a more unhindered supply and hence transition to renewable energy sources, how we want to systemically address the challenges our power exchanges are facing, increase the private sector participation, improve the capacity building, and finally achieve political consensus to understand that electricity, being the commercial good that it is adequately available for the country. And we definitely need to understand that the effects of curbing economic freedom increase corruption and they undermine the moral values of the society, which must be taken in all seriousness and addressed collectively. Thank you.
Thanks, Avantika. Jaydeep, your closing thoughts?
Professor Ajay Shah says electrons are not fungible, and we must be mindful what is the electron which is giving us electricity. And if we want our electron to be green, then the market forces has to operate in power sector. And for that to happen, road to power cannot be through power sector. So road to power has to be through many other routes, but may not be through the populist promises of power sector.
Thanks, Jaydeep. Well said. And with that, we conclude today's episode. You can now listen to Takshashila Institute's daily podcast, All Things Policy, on your favorite platforms, hosted on the IVM Podcast Network. Thank you, everyone.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.